Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the ADBI-OECD-ILO report launch of labor migration in Asia. My name is Pichaya Siriwanabut. I'm a capacity building and training economist from ADBI. I will be your moderator and also the MC of this launch. This report is the joint annual report by Asian Development Bank Institute, OECD, and ILO. So this year theme cover the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis and the post-pandemic future. Before we go to the launch officially, allow me just to share you the house rules for this launch. Your audio and the video will remain off. And then if you have any question, please type it in the Q&A window. By joining this event, please understand that you give us the consent to use without permission or compensation. So this event may be photographed, streamed live, or video recorded. By attending, accepting connection, or continuing participation in the event, participants thereby also consent to the possible use of their name, likeness, voice, spoken or written comments, or paper presentation in whatever form in all media publications, video sharing websites, recording, disseminations, or other external affairs proposed for the ADBI without compensation or permission. Also, the views expressed in the presentation are the view of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the view of the policy of the Asian Development Bank Institute. ADBI does not guarantee the accuracy of the data included in presentation and accepts no responsibility for any consequences of their use. Terminology used may not necessarily be consistent with the ADBI official terms. So before we go to the presentation, allow me just to invite the Deputy Dean of Asian Development Bank Institute, Dr. Seng-Ju Baek, to deliver the opening remarks. Dr. Baek has joined ADBI in May 2021. Prior to joining ADBI, he served as a Deputy Minister for Planning and Coordination at the Ministry of Economy and Finance of the Republic of Korea. He has 30 years of economic and development policy experience. His other obvious role is include serving as a senior policy analyst focused on developing countries for the OECD, as well as international development expert at the World Bank Institute. Deputy Dean Baek, I give the floor to you for the opening remark.
Thank you, Pichaya. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Very nice to see you all. This is Seng-Ju Baek, Deputy Dean of the ADBI. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the inaugural official launch of this ADBI-OECD-ILO joint publication. This report is an annual flagship publication co-produced by Asian Development Bank Institute, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the International Labour Organization for the past 10 years. The 2021 edition is an output drawn from the discussion in the 10th and 11th ADBI-OECD-ILO roundtables on labor migration in Asia, co-hosted by the three organizations in February last year and earlier in April this year. In a timely manner, this year's theme focuses on the impact of the COVID-19 crisis and the post-pandemic future. I would like to express my deep appreciation to our partners, Mr. Jean-Christophe Dumont and Jonathan Charoff from OECD, and Mr. Nguyen Lim Baro from ILO for their strong and continuous support on our joint activities. Especially this year, we embraced collaboration with our colleagues from the Asian Development Bank, Ms. Aiko Kikawa and Ms. Cindy Josto in the production of this report, particular for the chapter on migration technology. I would also like to thank and welcome them as the speakers at the launch of this joint publication today. Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted the flows of labor movement and the economic activities due to travel restrictions and economic lockdowns. This implies that the usual drivers of migration have also been disrupted, causing enormous barriers to labor mobility, negative social and economic impacts, and abrupt declines in remittance flows. Migrant workers are among the most affected and vulnerable groups. They have been more exposed to the risk of infection, unable to socially distance at the workplace due to the nature of their jobs, being laid off, and left without sufficient personal protection equipment and social security. Furthermore, the differing treatment between nationals and migrant workers is evident in social protection, leave, and income support measures. That being said, on the health front at least, robust response measures have been put into place on the part of governments to control and reduce infections. To support migrant workers, many countries have implemented work permit extensions and, in some cases, the regularization of their employment. Governments have also recognized the need to improve the standard of accommodation provided by employers. As a result, opportunities to build back better have been seen across countries and regions. Today, our presenters will give you more details about the trend and the future of labor migration in light of the disruptions and developments related to the COVID-19 pandemic enclosed in this joint report. These include up-to-date comparative statistics on labor migration flows, including evidence on the impacts of COVID-19 on flows and remittance, discussions on the future of labor migration in the aftermath of the pandemic, and how to use technology innovation and digitalization to facilitate labor mobility and its management. In response to these emerging challenges, policymakers and the regulators need to develop timely policy measures and innovative approaches to guarantee the effective management of labor migration. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to encourage active participation during the Q&A session in this launch. This platform provides you an opportunity to interact directly with the contributors of this joint report. I sincerely hope that this launch will deliver insights and useful policy guidance and offer statistical reference for practitioners, authorities, and policymakers. Last but not least, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to the organizing team and my ADBI colleagues for their efforts and contribution in preparing this joint publication and the annual roundtable on labor migration in Asia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Dean Beck, for the opening remarks. So next would be the presentation section. As mentioned by Deputy Dean Beck, We have 3 presenters today from the 3 organizations who are also the contributor of this job publication. Allow me just to spend a brief moment to introduce them. Dr. Jean-Christophe Dumont, the first presenter, is the head of International Migration Division in the Direction of Employment, Labor and Social Affairs, or OECD, since 2000. He joined OECD Secretariat in 2000 to work on international migration issues, and he oversees various OECD publications in the related fields. He was, prior to joining OECD, he was a research fellow at the Laval University. Our next presenter, Mr. Nilim Barua, he is a senior regional labor migration specialist of the Decent Work Team, Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific at the International Labour Organization. He's been working on the migration issues since 1998 and earlier in the development field. Before assuming his current responsibility, he was the Chief Technical Advisor of the ILO Technical Cooperation Labor Migration Project in Southeast Asia. Last presenter, Dr. Aiko Kikawa. She's an economist at the ADB Economic Research and Cooperation Department. Her research portfolio covers international migration and remittances, aging and demographic change, and economic analysis of the ADB project. Prior to joining ADB, she worked at the International Organization for Migration, and she led the technical assistance program on the overseas employment policies, remittances, and disaster relief operation targeting mobile populations. With no further ado, I give the floor to our first speaker, Dr. Jean-Christophe Dumont.
Thank you, Pichaya. Good morning, good afternoon to all of you. So let me start this presentation with the labor migration trends towards OECD country and some insight about remittances.
Jean-Christophe, you unmute. Can you unmute?
Oh. Do you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Sorry. So what is important to have in mind is that before the pandemic, migration from Asia to OECD countries, including Asian OECD countries, have been increasing very rapidly. Between 2000 and 2019, the annual inflow of Asian migrants towards the OECD increased from 1 million to 2.3 million every year. But obviously the pandemic has put an halt to this increase because of travel restriction and border closures. Migration flows to OECD country in the first semester of 2020 declined by 46%, and in the second quarter of 2020 declined by 72%. It has still progressively resumed, but overall the decline for 2020 would be close to 50%. What is important to note is that migration didn't come to zero. So there's still some flows going on, notably because there has been some exceptions in some essential sectors for seasonal workers or health workers, for example. In addition, OECD countries have put in place blanket relief measures, allowing those in the destination country to remain if they were unable to leave because of border closure and of a pandemic. Focus, next slide, please. Focusing more on specifically on Asia. You see here on the first two panels the admission of labor migrants to Korea and Japan. And as you can see, comparing 2019 to 2020, the flows have been almost zero between the second and partly third quarter of the year. They have started to resume a little bit in Japan, but are still fairly minimal in Korea. In other two major destination countries for Asian migration, which are Australia and Canada, you see here the inflow from Asia to these two countries. This is overall inflow, so not only labor migration. And what it shows is that Australia has maintained very strict control of its borders. And in 2020, there was virtually no migration there. Whereas in Canada, the decline has been close to 50%, 46% over the full year. Next slide, please. Another main destination country for Asian migration is the United States. The total decline for immigrant visas issued at foreign service posts was 50% for the fiscal year 2020. And the decline from Asia was 43%. If we focus on employment preference for permanent migration to the US, the decline is 52%. So also a very significant decline. But now looking at temporary migration to the US, as you can see on this graph, for student F1 visas, for highly skilled workers, H1B visas, or for intra-company transferees, L1 visas in this graph, what you can see is that the decline has been extremely severe, between 60 and 70%, with a very strong impact, obviously, on Asian migration when it comes to H1B, because a large part of the H1B highly skilled temporary visa in the US are coming from Asia, notably from India. Next slide, please. So as a result of this, but also of the trends that my colleague Nilim Barrow from ILO will depict in a minute on migration to Asian countries, we've seen a big decline in remittances. In 2019, total remittances estimated by the World Bank was around $700 billion. It has declined by 7%, 50 billion in 2020, as estimated by the World Bank, after almost a decade of annual growth of 5%. So it's really a reversal in a positive trend, which is expected to continue in 2021. As you can see, major recipient countries are obviously the largest countries, or those with a larger migrant population abroad: India, China, Philippines, Pakistan. I mean, the order will not change, but the decrease as estimated by ADB is particularly severe in Central Asia, almost more than minus 17%, and in East Asia, minus 11%. So next slide, please. My last slide is really about what will come next as far as OECD countries are concerned. Currently, the short-term issue remains to manage backlogs because we haven't get back to normal yet. There are still a lot of travel restrictions. This is underway for a specific category, which is international students. Some countries have been able to maintain the flows in 2021, but some others are still applying very strict restrictions. There is also an immediate questions about what to do with those who have been unable to leave and for whom some blanket relief measures have been applied, whether their status will be regularized, whether they will have to go back to their country of origin before being able to work again in the destination country. This is still a pending question in many cases. But I think that the bigger questions in the interest of this region are medium-term issues, because obviously the pandemic not only affects migration flows, it also affects the economic situation in destination country. And so the skills needs of tomorrow will probably be quite different from those of today or yesterday. And indeed, there will be some impact on expected migration from Asia to OECD countries. How labor migration will adapt to this new economic reality still remains to be seen. Also, there will be some important forthcoming change for highly skilled migrants. We've seen in the context of this pandemic that we can easily telework. And I think this virtual event today is a testimony of the impact of technology. How that will affect highly skilled migration from Asia to other OECD countries, including Asian OECD countries, remains to be seen. Whether firms will use more international telework as a substitute to international migration, or whether we will see highly skilled migration flow resuming to pre-crisis level. Let me end here and hand over to my colleague, Nilim Barua. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jean-Christophe Dumont. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Can I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk to you briefly about the pandemic and its impact in Asia with regards to labor migration flows and building back better. First of all, as you all know, we are in the midst of the pandemic yet. And this chart shows the reported infections and deaths in Asian and GCC Gulf countries per million inhabitants as of December 7, 2020. As you can see that countries of origin and destination for migration have been impacted. Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, all have had migrant workers disproportionately affected by infections at some point. Countries of origin like Nepal, India, Philippines, Indonesia have a high number of deaths. And as a group in GCC countries where many Asian workers reside, they have been the highest infections and deaths as of this date. Next slide, please. Similar to the picture that Jean-Christophe painted about destination countries, there has been a drastic fall in deployment from countries of origin. Deployment and outflows of migrant workers fell across the region. Deployment in the Philippines was largely halted in April. India saw deployment collapse the same month. Outflows from Bangladesh saw a similar fall with a pickup in December. In Indonesia, deployment stood at 38% of the previous year. As you know, in Asia, there are also, in addition to the OECD countries that Jean-Christophe mentioned, there are important destination countries like Malaysia, where intake of labor migrants in the temporary visa category has been suspended in 2020. And Thailand has also seen a big fall in new work permits. Next slide, please. While many migrant workers remain in the country, particularly in Southeast Asia, in Korea and in Japan, there have been large-scale returns, particularly from the GCC countries. This slide gives some examples about India, where the Vande Bharat program has repatriated 3 million nationals, that is not only migrant workers, as of November 2020. And in the Philippines, over 500,000 overseas Filipino workers have returned as of April this year, assisted by the Overseas Workers Administration in the Philippines. Next slide, please. Now, before the pandemic, in this chart, which shows the outflows from 12 Asian countries in South Asia, Southeast Asia, as well as the People's Republic of China. We had seen the flows had peaked in 2015 at 5.6 million workers. After that, there was a sharp decline in 2017-18, and then an uptake with flows reaching 4.9 million workers in 2019. The main reason for the decline in 2017-18 was the fall in labor migration outflows from South Asia to the GCC countries. This is explained by the fall in oil prices, the impact on infrastructure and other projects, and also periodic bans on immigration and immigration from countries of origin and destination during this period. Next slide, please. Now, migrant workers have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. If we see in August, when infections were at their peak in Singapore, about 90%, a little over 90% of infections were amongst migrant workers in dormitories. And similarly, we have seen a high proportion of infected migrant workers or foreign nationals in Malaysia and Thailand and in the GCC. What is the reason for this? First of all, many migrant workers have had to continue to work. They are essential workers. They have been workplace exposure reported. For example, in the medical glove sector in Malaysia, some countries have advised employers to retrench migrant workers first. There has been substandard and crowded housing. This issue has been magnified during the pandemic and has been highlighted. Migrant workers, for example, in Southeast Asia, are generally not included in unemployment insurance and income support measures. And this is true of the GCC countries as well. There has been an impact on women migrant workers. We have found that domestic workers, when they have lost their jobs because they reside with in the household of the employer, have been without shelter. Undocumented migrant workers have been subject to detention in unsafe conditions in some countries. And there have been return and reintegration challenges, particularly in South Asia and the Philippines. The Philippines, it has been reported, has even had to suspend the return of overseas Filipino workers because of a lack of funds to support their quarantine. Next slide, please. What have been the responses? Of course, governments and stakeholders have not been standing still. They have responded. Countries of origin have assisted with repatriation, quarantine, and in some cases with reintegration assistance, as in the Philippines. In countries of destination, there has been extension of work permits. In Thailand, there has been regularization of undocumented workers. Countries like Singapore and Malaysia have recognized the need to improve standards in accommodation. And in the vaccine rollout, there is a recognition in Southeast Asian countries that migrant workers, migrants, and nationals should be treated the same. Regional institutions like ASEAN have also responded, such as in the framework of the ASEAN Forum on Migrant Labor. What do we need to build back better? First of all, to improve emergency preparedness and to include migrants and migrant workers in emergency preparedness plans at different levels, to strengthen labor migration governance with regards to wages, to pay migrants decent wages so that they can access decent accommodation, to enhance wage protection. There have been many cases where migrants have not been paid their terminal benefits or the wages due, to improve housing and employer-provided accommodation, extend social protection to migrant workers so that they're treated the same as nationals, recognize domestic workers as workers and include them in the labor law, and increase the effectiveness of legal pathways for labor migration. So there's an incentive to use legal pathways rather than irregular and undocumented ways. And finally, as Jean-Christophe mentioned, access to skills development and technology lifelong learning. The pandemic has changed the way we work, and migrant workers should have access to skills development, recognition of skills on return, as well as access to technology. Thank you, and let me pass over to Aiko of the ADB at this point.
Okay, thank you, Nilian, and greetings to all the participants. So as the previous discussers have seen, this pandemic is really the game changer in every aspect of our lives. And what is seen is that accelerated the process of digitalization in all aspects of our lives. And the greater adoption of technology is also visible in the labor migration process, ranging from how recruitment or the interview processes are being done, how paperwork are done. On the remittance front, there's also increased adoption of a digital platform to send remittances. Next slide, please. So what we did in this chapter 3 is that to look at the extent of the use of technology in migration process. The data on migrant access to technology is somewhat scant, but available information do suggest how close that those technologies are to the majority of migrant workers. For example, a survey in Malaysia found that overwhelmingly majority, 90% of the migrants own a mobile phone, and about 2 out of 5 own a smartphone. So all those technology that assist and empower migrant, we term them as MIGTech, the abbreviated version of migration technology, which broadly have functions of facilitating labor migration by adding accuracy, safety, efficiency, and transparency. And what we've done in this chapter is a mapping exercise of a variety of MIGTech that consists of awareness raising information, monitoring labor standard, reporting abuses, rating migration services, and offering financial services. And we do so by categorizing those technology by the use in 3 stages of migration cycle. So that's pre-departure, during migration, and reintegration or return. And in addition to mapping, we also attempt to evaluate them where possible and suggest policy recommendation. Next slide, please. So we reviewed over 40 MIGTechs. We do not have time to go through each one of them, so please do download the report for description and evaluation of those technologies. What we present here are some overall finding and assessment. A word of caution, though, is that impact evaluation of specific MIGTechs remains somewhat limited and nascent. This can be attributed to the challenge in ICT impact measurement to start with, and there's also high user anonymity. So that in mind, but we still find about 4 promising features of MIGTech, which with some measurable impact. First, the MIGTech tools and next slide, please. Yeah, sorry, the one before. Yes, thank you. So first, the MIGTech tools and platform that facilitate information gathering dissemination are found to have improved access to information, resulting in greater awareness of migration risks and opportunities. So for example, qualitative evidence of this Waikia, the BBC's social media-based audio-visual program in Myanmar, it's found that the listener achieve a better understanding and knowledge about managing migration risks. Second, MIGTech platform have resulted in better understanding of migrant rights, so leading to greater confidence and willingness to access justice. And digital worker engagement tools such as Urula, LaborLink, which are the digital solution for labor protection and compliance, have particularly proven effective in raising workers' awareness and also willingness to act on workplace issues. The third important part of MIGTEC is that it has facilitated social cohesion and integration and migrants' ability to access welfare support services. For example, a qualitative report suggests that OFW Watch, an online community platform, has been increasingly found valuable in helping Filipino migrants find their communities in destination, access the authorities and the institutions to report abuse and seek help. And fourthly, MIGTEC platform and services hold a great potential in promoting migrants' social and economic empowerment. So for example, a case study of Value, a mobile wallet provider, suggests that digital solution for remittance and financial management can help empower migrant workers who could be often found in unbanked or less tech-savvy situation. When inclusivity is embedded in this development of apps and models, it can really empower them financially and economically. Next, please. So this new digital solution can present vast opportunities in enhancing migrant process, facilitating migrants' access to service and opportunities. And those include digital identity solutions and blockchain technology and big data sources. On the other hand, those opportunities are also met with some challenges that needs to overcome as the development goes, which include issues like data privacy and security risks. And there's also still an issue of measuring the effectiveness in this very anonymous setting, especially the one that crosses border, where identity of user is very difficult to count. Digital divide remains to be very severe for some subset of migrant workers, which is compounded by language barriers. And we also need to acknowledge that with the wider spread and use of technology is also inviting greater risk of supporting irregular and risky migration. Next, please. So there's no doubt that MIGTEC is sort of revolutionizing the way information is shared, disseminated, creating sort of a web of virtual but strong social community that can empower migrants. In order to benefit from those technologies, the following policies would have an important role to play. First, enhancing the digital literacy and skills of migrants should be an integral part of welfare programs throughout the migration cycles. It cannot be overstressed that inclusivity should be at the forefront in MIGTEC design, system, and process, and those should really be promoted by multi-stakeholder partnership and, where possible, funding support to create that kind of ecosystem for innovations. A lack of comparative data on labor migration and migrant access and the use of technology continue to limit the innovation. So data collection effort should be continued to be strengthened. And lastly, the reduction of regulatory restriction and policy barriers that sort of influences the supply of digital technology must be pursued, with a note of importance that it's very important to ensure that interoperability of regulation across the borders, because workers would use those tools crossing borders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all the three presenters. We're a little bit behind the schedule, so we have about 16 minutes for the Q&A sections. So I got a couple of the questions here from the audience. And one of the questions is from our colleague from Pakistan. And he just would like to know about the rule and regulations, which I assume that it's about what would be the rule and regulation just to help the migrant workers when it's come to the labor movement during the COVID-19 pandemic. Could I direct this to either Nilim or Jean-Christophe. Would you like to take this question?
Sure, Pichaya, I can answer first, and Jean-Christophe can add if he wishes. I think during the pandemic, there needs to be protocols and guidelines set for deployment during the new normal, because they are public health requirements. There would be public health requirements like testing and quarantine, and the cost of migration goes up. So it's a question of who would pay for this, and we wouldn't want the cost of migration to go up for the worker. So there have been examples of countries developing protocols for deployment in the new normal, such as Indonesia.
Jean-Christophe, you have anything to add? Okay then. So what the next question is about the actually from our audience from I guess essentially from India. This question from India, because as if there's if the three organizations, actually including ADB, I would like to add here, focus the issue on the challenges of the internal migrations. We know that for the joint publication, we're not really focusing on the internal migration, but if there's any plan in ILO, OECD, or maybe ADB that study about this, the issue on the internal migration in some country, some economy. Can anyone want to take this first? Maybe I have to go to Nilim again because it seemed like maybe in the area of the ILO.
So of course, our report has been concerned with international migrants, and international migrants are in a country other than their own. So in that way, they are more vulnerable, and often they are not treated the same way as nationals in the country of destination. Of course, internal migration in countries like China and India is huge in terms of numbers, and we know of the issues faced in India with regards to the movement of workers within the country during the pandemic, but our report has focused on international migration.
You have anything to add, or should I just skip to the go to the next question? Okay then. All right then. The next question, let me just, because this one is the one I'm actually wondering about myself. So this question is asking, do you think that to improve the life of the migrant worker, we need the new provision or the SAL implementation of whatever we have in our kitty? So basically, anything would it be already available, or is there anything that we should develop further? Can I just direct it to Jean-Christophe first?
Yes, thank you. Maybe I can also link that to a question which is specifically on vaccines, because certainly, I mean, this pandemic has raised a number of new issues that need to be addressed. So in particular, as Nilim said, the question of the housing condition of migrants in a number of Asian countries was brought to the forefront. The question of access to healthcare in general in OECD countries and elsewhere has been also brought to the forefront. And also the question of the sustainability of statuses of people who could not come back to their country of origin during this pandemic. I think it's fair to say that most countries, as Nilim rightly said, didn't stand still and have taken action during the pandemic to address these issues. And we've seen already some positive developments regarding housing in a number of OECD and non-OECD countries. We also see a general trend towards equal access to healthcare for those infected by COVID throughout. Question of vaccine is a bit more sensitive, but it's important to note that a number of OECD countries, including the United States, for example, already indicated that they will vaccinate everyone independently of their migrant status, so documented or undocumented. Obviously, migrants tend to be younger, and because vaccination is going through prioritizing older people who are more at risk, migrants may come, if not last, at least after this first cohort of vaccination. And vaccination is not necessarily going at a very high speed in every country. So there are still concerns about this risk of over exposure from migrants to the pandemic. We've seen in most OECD countries that they tend to be twice as much infected than non-migrants. And this is also visible in death rates in some countries where migrants are much at risk of dying from COVID. So this question of vaccine is not sorted out yet, but I think it's fair to say that countries have this in their radar and are taking action. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Christophe. Miriam, you have anything to add?
Just to add on vaccines, I think countries like Singapore and Malaysia have announced that migrant workers will be treated the same as nationals in terms of vaccine rollout. Of course, the question of age group, etc., will apply both to nationals as well as migrants. In some Southeast Asian countries like Thailand, where I'm living, there's no sign of vaccines on the horizon for anybody actually at the moment, except priority groups. But with regards to migrant workers, the challenge will be with regards to the undocumented migrant workers, because Malaysia has announced that they would like to roll out vaccines to undocumented migrants as well. So I think that will be the challenge, to register and vaccinate undocumented workers without them feeling threatened in terms of detention or deportation.
Thank you. Next question I want to ask Aiko. So our colleague from Indonesia would like to know about the MITEC that's related to abuse to worker. Is this connected to the law enforcement in respected country? So do you have any knowledge or any information about the MITEC that can just report this sort of abuse?
Okay, there are a variety of technology that through which worker report their abuses. There are some app that the company employs to monitor. It's either could be the factory owners, or could be the contractor who would hire that factory to produce goods. They would have application to monitor how workers are treated. And also workers would have access to voice their concern, skipping the employers, but the contractors. So they would increase more visibility in terms of how they would voice their workplace concern. Another way that they have, other countries have developed, is that either the host country organization, it could be the migrant groups or other host organizations, they develop an app where people can download and can really report and really seek rescues and so on. But this has to be built in a very, very strict, like privacy concerns and so on. So that has seen some success, but also you need a lot of background work for this technology to work. And another one, which has been widely also implemented, is that the origin country also have given the applications or other ways where migrants can report to their origin countries so that their embassies or the consular can provide those supports. So there are a few different ways this has been done. Of course, there's issue about whether the receiver of the information can respond immediately or not. It might not be like 991 call where people can respond quickly, while migrants expect that kind of thing. So there's some expectation differences and so on that needs to be overcome. But I think overall, it improves the information closure that existed because of the borders, because of the language. So it has a lot of promises.
Thank you, Aiko. There's a lot of audience that ask kind of similar question, which I also want to know by myself. So like in the post-COVID-19 pandemic, what would be the trend of the labor migration that you would expect it to see? Also in terms of the policy responses, like the health provision, the migration policy, just to help to facilitate the flow of the labor across the border in the post-pandemic, what would we expect to see in next year or maybe the year after? Can I start with Jean-Christophe first?
Yes, this is a difficult question, obviously, without a crystal ball, but a few points here. So first of all, as I said, the pandemic is leading to a very severe economic crisis. So the scope and the nature of a labor and skilled needs will change. They will even change more quickly because the pandemic is also acting as an accelerator of change, notably towards automatization and digitalization. So yes, there are some sectors where migrant workers have demonstrated to be essential. And this is not only in the healthcare system, this is also in transportation, in domestic service, in security, in cleaning industry, etc. But what we should also keep in mind is that the pandemic is not the only thing happening. And so not everything will be dictated by the impact of the pandemic. In particular, we've seen a structural decline in oil price, which may affect demand in Gulf countries. We've seen the UK leaving the European Union and reorienting its migration policy towards Asia. We've seen a change in the administration in the United States. All that will also affect opportunities for migration from Asia to other OECD countries and non-OECD countries. So the net effect is very difficult to estimate. I think one can really think that what will be critical is the upskilling of migrant workers so that they can in the future better respond to the skilled needs in destination, which most likely will increase.
Thank you. Nilim, you want to add in terms of the policy responses or any policy implication?
Yes, thank you, Pichaya. I tend to think that the labor and skill shortages remain. We have seen that employers are keen to recruit migrant workers, and this skills and labor shortages you can see at two ends. One is in terms of absolute labor shortages. I mean, the workers that Jean-Christophe mentioned, like in the health sector, and the care economy will also grow as due to demography and aging populations in different countries. And at the same time, at the other end, in terms of elementary occupations, work that nationals do not want to fill, and therefore there's a demand for migrant workers. So at this end, unless there's a structural change, if there's a structural change with increased wages, then of course the demand will fall. But at the moment, there's still a demand for workers in elementary occupations, in jobs that nationals do not want to do, in construction, in agriculture, in plantations, in domestic work, in manufacturing, in services. Thank you.
Thank you, Nilim. Aiko, you see that in the future there will be a stronger role of the digitalization that could play more in the post-COVID-19 pandemic, and how any challenges or any I know you already discussed about challenges and opportunities, but anything that should be the priority that we should address to promote the role of digitalization later.
Right. We're so used to the habit, and that adapting new thing has been always a challenge. But this COVID has really prompted some people to try something new. So it'd be important to see if this pandemic was just a temporary change, or that complete change of the behaviors, like some migrants starting to use different strategy to send fund. They probably save in different ways. Some employers starting to recruit on online, Zoom meetings. So how much of this would be actually sustained? How much, and to know what would then be kept and what was turned out to be not very good idea. Let's go back to the original one. I think that's something that we're very interested to monitor, and that this gives a sort of a good natural experiment to see what technologies would be adopted post-COVID or not. And this has been a really important testing ground, and we should really be taking a close eyes on how those technology adoptions are maintained or not. You're muted, Pichaya.
Thank you, Aiko. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and then we moving toward the end of this launch. Before closing this the launch for this joint publication, I want to give the floor to each presenter to probably spend 1 minute on the closing before we end this launch. Again, I start with Jean-Christophe.
Thank you. No, I would like just to take this opportunity to thank the partner organization, ADBI-ILO and IDB in this publication for long-standing and very fruitful cooperation. It's the 11th year that we are organizing this annual roundtable in labor migration in Asia, and 2020 has been critical. No doubt that things will take time before we can settle, and that 2021 will not look like normal at all. Question is more for 2022, but in the meantime, it's fair to say that the impact on sending country will be very high. Remittances have decreased let's say reasonably in 2020 compared to the drop in flows. But it's to be expected that the decline, as IDB anticipates, that the decline will be much stronger going forward, and that even if some needs for elementary work remains, there will be major change in the way migration is managed and take place across border from Asia, including to non-Asian countries. So I look forward to the next iteration of this annual roundtable as an opportunity to continue monitoring these trends and also inform policymakers. I'm very happy with my colleague Jonathan Chaloff to respond to any question participants would like to send in writing after this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean-Christophe. Nilim?
Thank you. Just in my closing remarks, let me reflect on two questions that were there in the chat box. One was about the skills, what kind of worker has been affected. We have seen that in some countries like Malaysia, they have kept open channels for skilled workers. So there has been movement of skilled workers with the public health measures being met, but suspended for workers in elementary occupations. The other question was about, going forward, do we use the tools, approaches that we have in our kitty or something more? So we do have international labor standards, which says that migrant workers and nationals should be treated equally. So they should have the same employment and working conditions. So this is very important to have, not only to protect the migrant workers in times of crisis, but also not to put the national at a disadvantage so that the migrant worker becomes cheaper or easier to employ. And going forward, building back better, we have seen some signs already that there's an increasing recognition of the contribution that migrants make, such as in Singapore. And there has been a recognition of the need to improve accommodation and housing. Also that the health of migrants impact the health of everybody. So the inclusion in vaccination rollout, for example, is also very important. But we also have to give attention to wages. Migrant workers are amongst the lowest paid in the destination country, even in countries which are quite rich. So that has to be paid, given attention either through minimum wages or to allow collective bargaining, freedom of association, allowing workers to bargain for better wages. Thank you.
Thank you. Last but not least, Aiko, please.
Thank you. I would also want to echo other panelists in thanking this event and also inviting ADB to this very important and long-lasting event. Maybe I touch on two things. One is about how related to the previous question about then what would see. I am still, although, and let me talk about a little bit about the remittances, because in 2020, we did see some optimism in the sense that, worst case scenario was averted for many countries in terms of the remittance flow. However, it's important to know that Asia's migration cycle tend to be very short. So what's happening is that many people are returning with having less stock of migrants who are the senders of remittances. So at least in a short, medium, few years time, when COVID is going to, disrupt the movement of people, we still have to be very cautious about the very low level of remittances. So for the countries of origins of migrant has to be continuing monitoring the welfare of the recipient household of the remittances, and also, provide more skills training and job referrals, entrepreneurship training, or the other support they could give to the returning migrants. And looking beyond when things go back to normal, then what we might see is some kind of a, more of a revamp of migration. So Nilim and Jean-Christophe has rightly mentioned, demand for worker is not gone. There will be. So that means that once things get normalized, you would have sort of a flood of migration phase at one point. Then country really have to be mindful from the origin country, how to protect those workers, and from the recipient side, how to manage the integration and also possible discrimination that comes from this revamp of the migration. So I think we would face a critical phase when migration returns to normal, these challenges. So both origin government and the destination government has to be very carefully monitoring the situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aiko. So we come to the end of the launch of this joint publication. I would like just to thank our presenter, Jean-Christophe Dumont from OECD, Nilim Barua from ILO, and Aiko Kikawa from ADB. I also like just to thank our colleague from OECD and ILO who involved in this joint publication. And also, last but not least, I'd like to thank you, my colleague from ADBI who helped with this joint publication and with this launch of the publication. I also like just to remind all the audience that this report can be downloaded from the ADBI website. So if you have any question or any comment further, feel free just email us anytime. We thank for your active participation and your comments on the Q&A box, and we look forward to welcoming you in our next event. Thank you, everyone.